So today we're starting a new study and we're looking at the questions of Christmas because the story of Christmas is stunningly beautiful and at the same time wildly unreasonable when we stop and think about it. There's the virgin birth, angels speaking, a star guiding people across continents, ancient prophecies aligning like a divine puzzle. And of course, the biggest claim of all, God becoming human. Now, one of my daughters, I'm not going to say which one, but one of them loves to tell elaborate stories. The type of stories where halfway through you're thinking as a parent, is this really true? And so you push back, of course she gets defensive, and then she clarifies maybe some of the details, and we get to the heart of what really took place. And for some people, when you hear the account of Christmas, the story of Christmas, there might be a part of you internally that says, really? Did it really happen that way? And if I'm describing you or describing somebody that you know, I want you to know that that's okay. Because understanding Christmas doesn't require us to switch off our brain. In fact, the significance of Jesus' arrival becomes clearer only when we lean in with both our hearts and our minds. And that's why for the next few weeks, we're going to look at what makes the unbelievable believable. And we're going to do this through Matthew's gospel. We're going to be parked in the first 2 chapters. And what's interesting about Matthew's account of Christmas is that he includes the part of Christmas that they don't make movies about. He writes, "This is the genealogy of Jesus." Now, Matthew's profession, he was a what? He was a tax collector, which means that he was paid to pay attention to detail. And as you read through Matthew's gospel, he wants us to do the same. He wants his audience to lean into the details because in Matthew's world, a name wasn't just a label. In Matthew's world, it carried weight. And so when Matthew writes, Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, when he writes the son of Abraham, a name represented a story. A name represented a lineage. A name represented a covenant. A name represented a promise. And so to Matthew, the genealogy is not simply a list. Rather, it's a theological argument. It's Matthew's way of saying, if you want to fully embrace what Jesus came to do, you have to understand who he came from. You have to understand who he came for. In fact, that's our bottom line today. Only when we understand who Jesus came from and who he came for will we begin to understand what he came to do. Now, we have to understand that Matthew's audience consisted of first century Jews. And there's a question that Matthew wants his audience to ask. And it's an important question, and it's a simple question, and it's this: why them? Why them? Because in the ancient world, they cared deeply about how genealogies were put together. Your genealogy was like your resume. It was your reputation. It was your credibility. And you only highlighted the honorable people in your life. And so if you had cousins, aunts, or uncles that you weren't so proud of, you didn't mention them in your genealogy because the default was to present the best possible version of your family. It's kind of like what we do today with Christmas photos. You know, you go on that family photo shot, right? There's 37 pictures that get taken. But afterwards, you only select the best 3 or 4 or 5 to put on the Christmas card. Now, fun fact, one year, I didn't get my wife's permission on which pictures I chose to put on the Christmas card. You can imagine that did not go over well. She says, "You only looked at how you look in the photo." She was right. I was caught. But that's our drift. We like to present the best possible version of ourselves. And the same was true in Matthew's time. In fact, King Herod burned public records of his genealogy so that he could rewrite a more impressive version. But Matthew's genealogy of Christ is not only scandalous, it breaks the rules. He does something no ancient genealogist ever did. He chose to include women. He chose to include women like Tamar, If you remember her story, it's a story of shame, injustice, exploitation, deception, and deep family dysfunction. But by Matthew including Tamar, he's declaring that the message of the gospel is that grace doesn't skip broken stories. Grace grows in them. By including the story of Rahab, Matthew is making a bold statement. Rahab, a prostitute by profession. Imagine this. You show up to a small group, and there's a new member of your small group. There's 10 or 11 of you in the living room. And it's customary, you go around and you say, hi, I'm so-and-so. I've been a part of the church, the group for so long. And then people start sharing what they do for a living. And this new member of your group says, I'm a sex worker. That feeling in the room, in that moment, is the same feeling that Matthew's audience would have felt seeing this name on the list. He includes Ruth. Ruth is a Moabite, an outsider, an immigrant. Now, I know during our current political climate, the subject of immigration is a sensitive one. But when it comes to the Bible makes it clear that Jesus didn't just come to the nations, Jesus comes from the nations. That when we dive into what the Bible says is that from the very beginning, his plan was to reach every man, woman, and child, all tribes, all nations, all people, all places. And that the message of the Bible is that our citizenship in heaven trumps our citizenship here on earth. And it's the genealogy of Christ that puts that truth on full display. And then there's Bathsheba, or as Matthew pointedly points out, Uriah's wife. Matthew refuses to say Bathsheba's name, not to shame her, but to shame David, because he abused his power. Matthew chooses to shine a massive spotlight on the darkest chapter of Israel's greatest king. Because the good news of the gospel is that nothing in your past, right now in this moment, is stronger than God's power to redeem it. Matthew wants us to understand that Jesus came from the outsider. He came from the abused. He came from the immoral. He came from the foreigner. He came from the forgotten. And for some of you, you look at this list and this is your story. You know what it's like to be on the outside looking in saying, will they welcome me? What if they knew my story? What if they knew my background? You know what it's like to be abused, that whether it's emotionally or physically. Maybe part of your story is that there are stories that you don't like to tell about at the dinner table when you meet new friends. And that there's a part of you that wonders, what if I get exposed? What if the skeletons of the closet suddenly come out? Would it change the relationship? Would they begin to see me differently? Some of you weren't born in this country, but you call it home. You know what it's like to be a foreigner. I think all of us know what it feels like to be forgotten. To walk into a room and say, do they see me? But what Matthew is drawing out, and what he wants us to understand, is what the theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer said so eloquently about Jesus' arrival, and that God is not ashamed of the lowliness of human beings. Advent reminds us that God marches right in. He chooses people as his instruments who are nothing by the world's standards. So Matthew says we look at who Jesus came from, but we also consider who Jesus came for. Because to Matthew's audience, his first century audience, a genealogy wasn't just about the past. A genealogy was about identity. The genealogy was about who belonged and who didn't belong, who was welcome and who was not welcome. And here, by including the likes of someone like Abraham, Matthew's declaring that Jesus came for the fearful and the doubting. Sure, Abraham's in the hall of faith. He was known as a man of faith, but he was also a man who lied twice to protect himself. Matthew wants us to see that Jesus came for the passive and the conflicted. If you're familiar with Isaac's story, you know that he repeated his father's failures. Some of us grew up and that's what we said, I'll never be like my parents. I'll never make the same choices that they did. I'm not going to fall in the same pattern, but there's this gravitational pull in your life that wants to pull you in that direction. And that's his story. And his choices nearly fractured his family through favoritism. Matthew wants us to see that Jesus came for those who deceive others, people like Jacob. Jacob lied and manipulated and wrestled his way through life, and yet the message of Christianity is that God still chose him. Let me give you one more. Matthew even wants us to see that Jesus came for those who think they have it all together. Maybe that's you and you just don't know it yet. You think you're doing everything right. You're checking off all of the boxes. I'm doing all the things that a good, godly person is supposed to do. King Hezekiah's story is that he restored worship. He was known for being obedient. In fact, the scriptures tell us that there was no king like him among all of the kings in Judah, yet his story is that later in life, his ego got the best of him. Because friends, this is what happens when we believe the lie of religion. When we start to say, because I obey, God owes me. The genealogy of Jesus declares that the Messiah came just as much for the irreligious as he did for the religious. That's why Tim Keller says it this way: in Jesus Christ, prostitutes and kings sit down as equals. See, church, there are no good people. There are no bad people. There are just people. People who need grace. People who need forgiveness. People who need a Savior. You see, what makes the unbelievable believable is that if you were making up a religious legend, you wouldn't start with the genealogy full of failures. You don't highlight the scandals. No ancient writer includes a Messiah whose lineage undermines his credibility, unless the story is true. So, Matthew is not trying to impress us. Matthew is trying to convince us. He's doing something that's both brilliant and very Jewish. Look what he says here. He says, thus there were 14 generations in all, from Abraham to David, 14 from David to the exile to Babylon, and 14 from the exile to the Messiah. Any fans of math this morning? Anybody like, I love math? A few people. God bless you. I think there was even less in the first service. And so if you're a math person and you're reading the genealogy of Jesus as Matthew unpacks it, you might say, you know what, the math just doesn't add up here. This is because in the ancient world, genealogies were often arranged in patterns to make a point. And here the point that Matthew's making is that in Hebrew, the numerical letters had numerical values. And so when you take the value of David's name, it adds up to 14. And this is Matthew signaling a declaration that the entire story, the genealogy, all points that Jesus is the promised son of David, that he is the true king. He is the Messiah. And every Jewish reader, upon reading these words, would have been leaning in and understood that right away. But it gets better. Stay with me. 3 times, he draws our attention, Matthew does, to this number here, 14. Because 14 also means double 7. And 7 is the biblical number for completion. It's the biblical number for fullness. It's the biblical number for rest. Stay with me now. Matthew is saying is that history has moved through 6 cycles of 7. And so to the Jewish audience, they would have been leaning in and they would have been asking this very important question: where is the 7th 7? Where is the final cycle? Where is the moment of ultimate rest? Where is the moment of healing? Where is the moment of completion? Where is the moment of restoration? And what Matthew is saying is that is Jesus. Matthew's answer is Jesus is the 7th 7. He is the moment everything broken is to be restored. Jesus is the Sabbath of Sabbaths. Jesus is the completion of completions. But it gets better. In the Old Testament, every 7 years was a Sabbath year. And every 7 sets of 7 led to what is known as the year of Jubilee. And we read about this in Leviticus. This is the time where debts were wiped out, slaves were set free, land would be restored, families would return home. This was the great reset that God built into Israel's calendar. And hear me, when Jesus showed up and began to do ministry, the very first sermon that he preached was a declaration that the 7th 7 has arrived. Luke tells us what he said. The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. If you look at Leviticus, you would understand that this is Jesus' declaration saying that I am the Jubilee that the world has been waiting for. This is not a stitched together folklore. This is not happenstance. This is the culmination of a 2,000-year punchline that Jesus is the Messiah and that the Messiah has arrived. Matthew's making it clear. This is who he came from. This is who he came for. You need to understand what he came to do. Look at what Matthew says here. He says in 14, from the exile to the Messiah. Matthew's message is that Jesus has come to end the exile. Like, wait a minute. We went through the story. We've been reading the Old Testament. The exile, that's past tense. No, what Matthew's drawing out here is that the exile represents distance from God. Exile represents consequences of sin. The exile represents that this world is not as it should be, but Matthew's saying that Jesus is the end of the exile, that Jesus is how we now return home. He doesn't come to improve your story. No, Jesus comes to finish your story. He's the end of exile, the only way to restoration, the only way to true rest. He is now our purpose to reflect love to the world around us. Our bottom line one more time. Only when we understand who Jesus came from and who he came for will we begin to understand what he came to do. So as the worship team comes back up to the platform, many of us are familiar with Advent. And last Sunday was the first Sunday of Advent, and we remember hope. And there's a tradition that goes all the way back to the 1500s, comes out of Germany, where they would light candles. And this week, we light this candle to remember love. And if we lean into what Matthew has to say, we see just how far God has come, just how far he's traveled, so that we might experience the true love of Jesus. So here's my invitation for us this week. Would we be willing to receive his love personally? Would we be willing to rest in his love confidently? Would we be willing to reflect his love generously? Because there's some in this room today, and the story that you're choosing to believe about yourself is that you're not worthy, you are alone, you are forgotten, that your sin is too much for God. And the genealogy of Jesus tells you that you are welcome, that he has a place for you, that Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection is sufficient for you, and that once you transfer your allegiance to King Jesus, nothing can separate you from the love of God. So maybe today is that day that you walk in to true love. And for those of us that believe that, here's my challenge. What would it look like for you to rest in it confidently? Because if we take seriously the genealogy of Jesus and that Jesus is the 7th 7, this is a reminder that even when God's people wander, even when the most powerful kings fail, even when we look at the world and we begin to think sin reigns, even when exile comes into our life, generations may pass, but it's God's love that keeps us. And hear me, friends, if his love is strong enough to sustain 42 generations of dysfunction, his love is strong enough to carry you through anything that you're going through today. If you choose to rest in his perfect love. Finally, for those of us that have chosen to rest in his love, what would it look like for you to reflect it generously? See, the message is that while you were enemies to God, God first loved you in the way that he first loved me. And the message of Christianity is that we will be known for following Jesus based on whether we choose to love others the way that he's loved us or not. So who is it in your life that you can love in a way that the world might say it just doesn't make sense? Because the genealogy doesn't exist to simply tell us that God welcomed broken people into his family. The genealogy exists so that we would pick up that torch and that we too would be the type of people that welcomes broken people into our lives with a message of redemption. Who is it that God is putting at your doorstep and saying, would you love them the way that I have loved